Good morning, welcome. How'd you enjoy that bus ride? Probably a lot of you haven't been on a school bus in a long time. I know I spent a lot of time in the driver's seat of a school bus, but it's good to have you here with us today. My name is Keith Harris. I was born in 1919, and my great-grandparents, Alexander and Margaret Kelly Harris, came out from Pennsylvania in 1872 and started the Harris Farm about 5 miles east of town, just south of the Burlington railroad tracks. And there I helped them out, and I learned a lot about farming and the importance of farming. One day, when I was a boy, my grandpa and I were coming back from Elgin, and alongside the road we could see one of these barnstorming planes. And Grandpa, surprisingly, said, "Hey, how about if we go up for a ride?" I said, "Sure." So we got in the plane and up we went, and Grandpa's hat flew off, lost it, never to be seen again. But I really found a joy in flying. I got hooked on it. I got hooked on flying. I graduated from Earlville High School. My favorite class was the 2-year mechanical drawing class, and I used a lot of that information throughout my life. After graduation, I attended an airplane mechanical school out in Lincoln, Nebraska, and when I graduated from that, unfortunately there were no jobs to be had. So I came back home to the farm and continued farming. Well, in September 1939, you probably know that war broke out in Europe. The next year, the U.S. initiated the first peacetime draft, and there was no way I was going to get drafted into the infantry, so I enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps, now known as the U.S. Air Force. A little later, as we know, in December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. A couple days later, the Germans and Italians declared war on the U.S., and we were in it for the long haul. Now, I was up in Alaska at the time, but then I went to California to take basic pilot training. And then after that, I went to Washington, where I had B-17 pilot training. Now, those B-17s were the advanced aircraft at the time. They were the frontline bombers during the war. And we were known as the Bomber Boys, and a reporter had referred to them, to the B-17s, as flying fortresses. Now, I was stationed in England during the war, part of the 390th Bomber Group of the famed 8th U.S. Air Force. We got to name our bomber, and the crew settled on the name of Spot Remover. Spot Remover, because we would eliminate spots that were valuable to the enemy. Now, those B-17s are a little dangerous to fly. One time, we were flying, it was a shuttle mission to go from London to dropping our bombs on Regensburg, Germany, and then continuing on to North Africa. Well, you get all those planes up there and there's all kinds of brass flying around all over the place. We did suffer a little bit of wing damage, and so at 20,000 feet, we were going over the Alps and we began to lose air, so we had to descend to something like 17,000 feet. And then as we're continuing south, we're getting close to North Africa, and one of the engines runs out of fuel. So the crew shifted fuel from one tank to another, and we just barely made it to the North African coast, and fortunately we were able to land in a dry lake bed there in North Africa. Now, I spent 11 months of the war in Europe. We were credited with 11 enemy aircraft downed, and I did 25 bombing missions, and was able to receive a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and a presidential citation, which was a third of its kind on record. So all in all, I spent about 7 years in the military and went all the way from a private to a major, which is the hat I'm wearing today. Now, when I was on leave in 1941, April of 1941, I met and married on April 18th, so I don't forget the date. We don't want to forget the anniversary, gentlemen. I married Margarita, also known as Margie Green. She was a local librarian here for many years. Now, we lived on the Mitchell farm, and I also farmed Dad's land with my brother Bob. And also in 1848, we bought a house on, I did say 1941 we got married, didn't I? Okay. Sometimes the years runs together. 1948, we bought a home on Brown Street, and there we raised our 3 sons and our daughter, Alan, Kathleen, Don, and Dale. Now, I never lost my love of flying, and in 1961, my brother Bob and I bought a 1946 Piper Cub from Stan Hum. Now, I enjoyed giving rides to the kids, and I kept a notebook of all the kids and people I gave a ride to. Sadly, in 1974, our Cubby was destroyed in a thunderstorm. Oh, but I wasn't just a B-17 bomber and an airplane guy and a farmer. I also drove a school bus, right? I mentioned that. In 1948, the Earlville School started a program where they would bring the rural kids in to town for school. Now, I had a pretty good rapport with the kids. Obviously, when you're flying them, they got to trust you. And I thought, well, that driving route, that'd be a pretty good part-time job to go along with my farming. And so I took that route, and I loved the kids on the route. They seemed to love me. They looked forward to seeing me because I like to do things for them. Like every Friday, they would come running to the bus expecting to get a pack of gum. And sure enough, I've done that for you today, where you can grab a piece of gum when we're done here if you so wish. One time we had a little crack in the windshield that looked like a pair of wings. And I told him that I had a pet fairy named Herman. And that's what happened. He left a wing imprint. Well, the next morning, when the kids got on the bus, I had a cardboard box and they could hear something in there. But I told them not to look. Don't look, don't look. And we got to school and we opened it up and a little bird flew out. And so they were not expecting that. Now, I drove a school bus for some 31 years. And I found that it was like flying a B-17. One, you start out early in the morning. 2, the people behind you don't really want to go where you're going. 3, the noise level is about the same. And 4, everybody's happy when they get home at the end of the day. So in 1979, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor. I had surgery. I spent time in Mayo's. And so it was time for me to hang up my bus driver hat. Sadly, in 1980, I passed away at the very young age of 61. So thank you very much for coming out today to hear my story. And my final thought to leave you with is one of my favorite sayings: enjoy this day, it will not come again. Thank you.
Good afternoon, folks. How many of you knew that whistling was once a profession? Well, I'm here to tell you the story, my story, of a vaudeville professional whistler. Some may ask, what is vaudeville? Well, Dr. Webster calls it theatrical entertainment with song, dance, juggling acts, and in my case, whistling. You guys remember Abbott and Costello, right? They were popular when I was performing. My name, Robert Harry O'Brien Childs. I was born in 1890, April 5th. My parents were divorced soon after I was born. And when I was 4, my mother married Robert Dr. Robert Giles, a dentist in Chicago. He decided to open up a practice in Earlville. My mother, Dr. George, rode their bicycles from Chicago to a farm north of town. When he came to set up his practice, he treated patients mainly in their homes until he found an office in the tour building, which we think is where the laundromat sits right now. My mother, Nora, in the same area, opened up Auntie Giles' gift shop on the first floor. I could still hear the little bell ring as you entered the store. It was a variety store with a newspaper smoke stand inside. She carried everything. Antiques, Columbia records, newspapers, sheet music, postcards, greeting cards, and everyone's favorite, and mine, penny candy. She had a player piano with many rolls and a beautiful gramophone that Dr. Giles played. They loved to entertain people and they came in the store. And it was really a hangout for all ages. The daily newspaper was delivered by train in the morning. They would drop the paper off on the platform at the depot as the train passed by. My job, go get that paper, get it to the store in time for people to buy it. At an early age, I could whistle. And I loved to whistle when I worked at the store. I had a natural ability. I could imitate birds and I could whistle many songs. A lot of times when the customers would come in the store, they would ask me to whistle their favorite tune. And I was happy to do it. You know, Dr. Giles and my mother loved the outdoors. They loved to camp. They set up a tent one time in the Bates pasture in Earlville. And one night after a busy day, they coming home, they found a cow in their tent. They shoot it out, roped it off, and they continued living there till they found an apartment. Dr. George played his gramophone at the Lyric, and he did it for several events sponsored by schools and clubs and churches. And as I got older, they asked me to entertain. And I would imitate birds and whistle many songs, you know, performing in front of an audience and seeing the smiles on their faces. I knew I wanted to be an entertainer. So I left Earlville. I went to Chicago to study, and I learned to use my lips, my tongue, and my teeth to imitate birds and instruments and enhance my songs. I started performing in Chicago and surrounding areas. I was known as a comedy whistler and impersonator. I started touring through Michigan, Wisconsin, into Canada with the Western Vaudeville Circuit, making $45 a week with a promise of a raise if enthusiasm continued. You know, it's like $1,400 in today's money. I remember one engagement, I was imitating a cat and a dog fight. And I didn't know that there was a young pup in amongst the audience. Well, all of a sudden I see this dog bristle his fur and straighten his tail and begin barking, and he wanted a piece of the action. You know what? The press thought it was hilarious. You know, I think they even wrote a news article on me. Performing in Chicago wasn't always easy. You know, it's sometimes dangerous. I remember after a show, walking back to the hotel, these two thugs approached me. They took my watch, my money, and they wanted my suitcase. I pleaded with them. I said, hey, it's got my only suit in there, and I need it for tomorrow's performance. They let me keep it. Between tours, Frank Edgert of the Lyric asked me to come back to Earlville so people could hear me. In addition to this regular program of motion pictures, I was to whistle and mimic several selections. At that time, admission went from 10 cents to 15 cents. The world entered conflict. I entered the Army in April of 1918. My orders were to be in a motor artillery unit, which meant I would see a lot of action. In the barracks next to me, there was an orchestra, and I would go there and I would whistle with them. They must have thought I was pretty good because I got transferred and I toured the Pacific with the Western Vaudeville recruits until my discharge in 1919. After the service, I continued touring a lot, toured the world, and I performed with the Cotton Blossom Playboat for a long time. This was in the 30s. Well, 1931, the Depression hit. It was tough on everybody. But my company continued to pay us and kept us going. My mother continued to run the shop after Dr. Giles died. And after I finished entertaining, I came back and ran the newspaper smoke shop with my mother. You know, at that time, comic books were all the rage, and I carried the latest and the best. You know, with each new selection, Ed Wolf and son Gary would come in and buy one of each. You know, I was always told that they were always real good about sharing those with the rest of the kids in the neighborhood. I passed away October 1955, and my mother shortly after. You know, being in front of an audience today brings back many memories for me, and I hope you enjoyed the story of Robert Harry O'Brien Giles and his family. Thank you.
Have you ever heard the phrase robbing the cradle? Yes. Well, that's exactly what I did when I arrived in Earlville in 1853. After setting up my law practice, I married Octavia Norton. She wasn't quite 15, and I was 25. My name is Alonzo Jackson Grover Sr., AJ for short. As a young man, born in Bethel, Maine, I studied law and was admitted to the bar in Portland, Maine in 1853 at the young age of 25. As a student, I was described as a fluent speaker, debater, and a radical thinker. During the mid-1800s, the main political issues centered around human rights, especially those of slavery. These issues became my lifelong passion. Octavia and I were blessed with 6 children: Ralph, Nellie, Oliver, Neil, Victor, and Alonzo Jr. Let me brag on our son Oliver for a moment. As a teenager, he left Earlville and went to Chicago and later to Europe to pursue a career as an artist. His artwork became very well known in the art community and earned him the prestigious Yerkes Prize. You can see some of his artistry in the dome of the Blackstone Library in Chicago. After moving to Earlville, I became very active in political circles, assisting in setting up the first Republican organization in LaSalle County. Being a fierce advocate for anti-slavery principles, my home was mobbed frequently for harboring runaway slaves. You see, my house was a welcome place for fleeing slaves and all those who worked for their freedom. But you can imagine how frightened my family was during these raids. But we were committed to helping the men, women, and children escape slavery. Besides being fierce advocates for abolitionists, my wife, Octavia, and I supported the women's right to vote. Octavia, along with our good friend, Susan Hoxie Richardson, and other women from town, would gather together to discuss how they may affect change in this area. I wrote and then published an article in 1854 on this subject. That document became the inspiration for the women's rights movement in Illinois. You see, I would do anything in my power to advance the women's suffrage movement. I even wrote a letter to the then Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln, asking for his support for the women's right to vote. In his response, Lincoln agreed, and we exchanged several letters back and forth on this subject. But in the end, as president, Lincoln favored emancipation of slavery over women's rights. But I was not a man to be deterred, so I sent several articles to the Chicago Tribune supporting women's rights. To my surprise, they would not publish my articles in their newspaper. So I started my own newspaper, the Earlville Transcript. It was one of the first newspapers in Earlville. But it was only in operation for about 3 years, and unfortunately, no copies of it exist today. It may not surprise you that many of the prominent citizens of that time, including the Reverend Harrison of the Congregational Church, did not agree with the articles I published in my paper. But fortunately, Mr. Signor, who owned the Earlville Gazette, chose to copy my articles and publish them in his paper, along with their rebuttal. I would then rebut their rebuttal in my paper. This back and forth name calling had the same fire and sarcasm that you hear in today's political speeches, just more proper English. After 30 years of marriage, Octavia and I divorced in 1886. A year later, I married Nettie C. Smith in Iowa and moved to my farm in Kansas. Although at this time my law background was helpful, I chose to test my skills as an inventor. I did obtain patents on a field cultivator, a cattle car, and some other agricultural items. In 1888, I was a union labor candidate for Congress. But in the end, the Democratic Party wouldn't endorse me because of an article I'd written earlier criticizing the Catholic Church. I died of brain fever in my Kansas home in 1891 at the age of 62. My body was then brought back to Earlville and buried in the family plot next to my wife, Octavia. My second wife, Nettie, was never mentioned in my obituary. But as you can see, there are 2 gravestones here. One is a family stone with my name, Octavia, and our 6 children listed on this. Second stone, which was erected later by Nettie, with the inscription, "Here lies Alonzo J. Grover, a brave and honest man, champion of human rights, by his wife, Nettie. Despite my fierce disposition and somewhat radical ideas, I hope you walk away from here today believing that I made a difference, especially in fighting slavery and working for the rights of women. Thank you.
Votes for women, votes for women, votes for women. There will be no complete equality until women themselves help to make the laws and elect the lawmakers. These are the words of my dear cousin, Susan B. Anthony. You know her as the leader of the suffrage movement in America. You also will remember that there was a silver coin, a silver dollar, cast in her likeness from 1979 to 1981, and again in 1999. I am Susie Hoxson Richardson, and I was born in 1822 to a devout Quaker family in Massachusetts. My mother was a pastor for 30 years in the Quaker Church. This is at a time when no other churches would have considered raising a woman to that level of prominence. But Quakers were different. They believed in educating and promoting women to the highest level. Quakers also objected to slavery, war, and capital punishment. In 1844, I married George Richardson, and following our honeymoon, we decided to move to Illinois. We moved here in a horse-drawn, covered wagon over rough roads and crude trails. Imagine traveling over 1,000 miles like that. And despite all of that adversity, I was able to bring with me my most beloved wedding gift, a wickless kerosene lantern with a porcelain shade. It arrived intact. When we reached Illinois, we settled just west of here on a farm along the Indian Creek. These were in the days when Chief Shabana was still here. It was also during the days when the Carter millstones were just at the end of a path that still exists for grinding grain for the local farmers. Eventually, we were able to purchase a 2-story home in town, and that is on Ottawa Street. There we raised our 5 children: Azalea, Edmund, Nellie Neal, and of course, we had to have a Susan. In the summer months, my cousin Susan B. Anthony would come and stay for visits, and I listened very closely to her messages, her beliefs, and her passion on women's suffrage and votes for women. I began to internalize my own passion for women's rights. I read Mr. Grover's 1854 essay, and it affirmed my beliefs, and I decided to act on them. So in 1855, I called a meeting in my own home to address women's suffrage. In attendance was Octavia Grover, Mr. Grover, my cousin Susan B. Anthony, and myself, among many others. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we are here today. That meeting is the first women's suffrage meeting in Illinois. It's documented in history, written down in the history books, and there's a 5-foot monument in Dodge Park to commemorate that meeting. Soon the Civil War began and we lost momentum. But following the Civil War in the 1860s, our momentum picked up again. In 1871, we formed the Earlville Women's Franchise Association. And our elected official was none other than Reverend Harrison's wife. She was to be our president. But promptly, upon returning home that night, she tendered a letter of resignation. The Reverend Harrison did not agree with our objectives. Along came 1891, and a lot of things happened for Earlville in 1891. The Illinois Suffrage Society Convention was held in Earlville. And my daughter Susan and I were invited to be guest speakers. Also in 1891, women earned the right to vote in school board elections. 36 women cast a ballot in that first election. Though we made a lot of progress, it was 50 years until women earned the right to vote following our 1855 meeting. That was 12 years after my death. It was also another 7 years until the 19th Amendment was ratified on the U.S. Constitution. I died in 1901 at the home of my dear daughter Susan in Milwaukee, and I'm buried at the end of this row of graves where you see the pretty yellow flowers. I was just a young, simple Quaker, housewife, mother, but I decided to pursue my passion and make a difference, and I did. In conclusion, I would like to say to each of you today, form your passion and act on it. I am Susan Hoxsey Richardson, and I thank you for coming today. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Albert Carpenter Tillman, and I was born in Earlville in 1870 to DeLoss and Ellen Brackett Tillman. My brother Onan came along 6 years later. My father was a veteran in the Civil War from New York. He was restless after the war, traveling around and ending up in Earlville, where he met and married my mother. He was a carpenter by trade and built his family home in the 1870s, which still stands today, on Ottawa Street. When Ona married, they lived across the street. When I was 10, my father joined the silver strike in Colorado, hoping to get rich. He did not get rich, and he returned back to Earlville and the carpentry trade. Horse harness racing was popular in my youth, and there were several racetracks in town. I loved horses and racing. Growing up, my brother and I trained horses on the track northwest of town on what was later known as the Hitchens Farm. Eventually, we traveled around the Midwest racing our own horses. Another track was located 1.5 mile east of what was the Clyde Carter Farm. It was called the Old Fairground Track. It was located on 20 acres and included a large amphitheater and cookhouse, as well as a 120 stall stable. Did you know that the opening race of the old Illinois Valley Circuit was frequently held there? At one time, there were 26 starters at Earlville's 3 o'clock trot. Earlville's racing events attracted horses from all over the Union with purses around $400. I drove in many races and often won. I was 16, I won a race in Saratoga, New York. Maybe it was due to the wheels on my buggy being smaller than usual, because before long everyone had smaller wheels on their buggies, whatever it took to win. Some owners even used aluminum horseshoes to cut down on the weight. I ran a heat in Indianapolis one year and set the world record in the high-wheeled sulky race. I was the youngest driver in the sport at that time. Dr. Bliss, the current veterinarian in town, was also involved with racehorses. He saw something in me and took me under his wing. Since my parents had little money, Dr. Bliss helped to finance my education. I graduated in 1899 from McKillop Veterinary College in Chicago and interned with Dr. Bliss. At first, I lived at his house, so I would be available for calls. A veterinarian was on call 24/7, and many times the roads were not paved and many times washed out due to the rain. It took a long time to get to the farmsteads. And animals were the farmers' livelihood, and if they lost them, their families could starve. Sometimes I was paid with canned goods or they would do our laundry. In 1900, I purchased the old wooden Earlville School building and moved it to what is now the parking lot at the post office, and I made that my office. In 1905, I married Loretta Carter, and we lived with her father. You will meet her soon. After Loretta's father died in 1917, we moved to the house on the corner of Ottawa and Union Street to be close to my parents and brother. My descendants still live in that house today. I never lost my love of horses and racing. I was known to be fast and accurate with a stopwatch. Had many requests to run a stopwatch judge at the tracks at Earlville, Sandwich, Aurora, and even Chicago. In the 1920s, Mr. Patsy Cruz and I bought the ground where the golf course is today. We planned to lay out a 1/2 mile track from the bottom of the hill where number 1 is over to the number 5 green. Other investors wanted to get involved and make it a recreational park with rides and concessions. The interest in horse racing declined over the next few years, and our dreams and plans of that went away. In 1935, I was elected mayor, served 7 years. During that time, saw improvement in city sewers, blacktopping the streets, new sidewalks, and improved street lighting. Dodge Park tennis courts were built, and the plaques for women's suffrage and Ralph Dodge were installed. I remained the mayor and veterinarian right up to my death in 1942. I spent the day vaccinating hogs, and upon returning home, I became ill, and I passed away the next day. Oh my, look at the time. I better let you move on so you can hear more about my beautiful wife, Retta.
Thank you, Bert.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Loretta Mae Carter Tillman. My story begins in 1876, when I was born to Heman and Helen Phillips Carter on their farm east of Earlville on 14th Road. They had lost my sister Marion the previous year to typhoid pneumonia. She was only 13 and a half years old. I was the youngest of 4 surviving children. My siblings were Charlotte, Edward, and George Carter. When I was a teen, I became interested in painting, and I traveled to Aurora and the Art Institute of Chicago for lessons. When I began studying art in the late 1800s, art schools were just beginning to allow women into life drawing classes. Understandably so, though my parents would not allow me to attend since the male models were usually nude. Everywhere I looked, I could see a picture that needed to be painted, sketched, or photographed. I would paint on anything available, a lid to a barrel, wooden plates, fine china dishes, glass, plywood, burlap, or academy board. I loved working with both oils and watercolors. Painting on shells or clay became popular in the 1920s during the Art Deco movement, which focused on using handcrafted and organic forms. This movement, along with the arts and crafts and realism movements, were my main influences to my art style, as they were in opposition to the Industrial Revolution and holding on to nature and the countryside in everyday life, which was so dear to my heart growing up on the farm in rural Earlville. the countryside was the main subject matter to many of my works. I even used boards from the barn on the Carter farm to make frames for some of my paintings. Photography became available to the general public around the 1880s, and as I gained more experience working with paints, I explored photography as an art modality as well. I even started a dark room in the attic of our house. My father retired from farming in 1897, and we moved to a home on North 3rd Street. My mother had passed in 1904, and it was around that time I began courting this handsome gentleman from town, Dr. Albert C. Tillman, better known as Bert, the town veterinarian. Bert and I married in 1905 and lived with my father to take care of him. We had 2 children, Ida Melvira, named after our mothers, and Albert Carter. After my father passed in 1917, Bert and I moved our family to a home on Ottawa Street. One of my favorite gifts to him was this animal-themed painting I did on the inside lid of his travel kit for vet visits. I think it was one of his favorite gifts as well. He was so surprised when he saw it, and of course his favorite was horses, which is why I used that. My daughter Ida, she remained in Earlville, marrying a local farmer, Harold Bolt. They gave us 3 wonderful grandchildren, Sarah, Joyce, and Edwin. Ida was an organist for the Methodist Church for over 40 years and played the piano for many school activities. She also traveled with a big band jazz orchestra when she was younger. Some of you may remember Harold as the coach for the Earlville Victorian softball team when both of his daughters played. Eddie was a football player for Eastern Illinois University and served in the Army during Vietnam War. Our son Albert was serving in World War II when my husband Bert passed away in 1942. After the war, he devoted his life's work as an English professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. In addition to painting, I also loved gardening and baking for my grandchildren. Sarah's favorite was molasses cookies. I made a batch to share with all of you up at the museum when you get back. Hopefully there's still some left. At the age of 89, I was still actively painting, and I was working on a picture of Starved Rock when I became ill and died a few weeks later. That painting remains undone in our family home on the corner of Ottawa and Union Streets. The Garden Club honored me with a showing of my collection, including over 150 works after I passed away. And the Historical Society included some of my works in an art show they had sponsored in 2016. I didn't like a lot of attention focused on my artwork, but I loved giving my paintings as gifts, especially to family. Some of you may have some in your home. In a way, I feel like my family lives on through my works even to today. Thank you for stopping by.
Good afternoon. I've had many titles in my lifetime, but on Grant Street I was known as the Lightning Bug Man. The children would come to our backyard in the summer, and I would drill holes in the lids of mason jars and help them catch lightning bugs. I love to see the smiles on their faces. I was born James Wales Rowe in 1903 in DeKalb, Illinois. When I was 11 years old, tragedy struck our family when my dad was killed in an auto accident. You can imagine how devastating that was for my mother, Mildred, my brother, Royce, and myself. We left DeKalb and moved to Earlville to live with my grandparents, Albert and Alice Wales. We lived on the corner of Main and Brown Street. My grandfather had built his house on the foundation of the old Baptist church. Several years later, Mom married Andy Wold, a local farmer. Andy was also the pitcher of the Earlville Rangers, and I became the bat boy. My mom and Andy married in 1920, As a teenager, I worked at Remick's Confectionery. I had visions of serving young, pretty girls across the counter. I soon found out that my job was in the basement from 5 a.m. till midnight every day. My Uncle Rube owned the store, and he considered me cheap, young labor. I finished my high school education and graduated in 1923. One day in 1930, my friend Doc Nichols and I were on a fishing trip to Big Round Lake in Wisconsin. While we were in our boat, we noticed a young couple across the way experiencing engine trouble. We went over and offered to tow them back to shore. They accepted, and they were so grateful to us that they invited us to a party that night. We soon found out that we were partying at one of Al Capone's hideouts. The young lady was the daughter of Al Capone's lawyer. The young man was Butch O'Hare of O'Hare Airport. During the Great Depression, I took a risk and started my own business, the Jim Rowe Insurance Company. After a few years, I merged with Harold Miller, and we became Miller & Rowe Insurance Company. The Depression years were challenging for all of us. The Earlville banks were forced to close by moratorium. The local farmers and businessmen had nowhere to turn for financial help. 3 years went by with no bank in town. From that anguish came ideas on how to survive. Howard Miller and I banded together with F.J. Genter, Robert Widener, and E.W. Malley to form the Earl Finance Company. It's what you would call a loan assistant company today. Trust started to grow. Within 3 months, we were financially stable. We did it. We rode those sparse years out, and finally in 1938, the National Bank of Earlville opened. A few years later, the Earl Finance Company was liquidated. I still had not found the woman of my dreams until I met Gertrude Boltz. She was a clerk who worked at the local A&P grocery. I enjoyed stopping by for a chat and finally got around to asking her a very important question. Did she want to join my family and me on a fishing trip? Now, I won't brag about who caught the largest fish, but I'll just tell you that Gert could hold her own with anyone. And yes, I did get around to asking her the other question. We were married in 1940. I was 37 years old, and Gert, she didn't share that information. We made plenty of time for fishing and golfing. I was a lifelong member of the Earlville Golf Course. And I even helped finance hole number 3. It's a beauty. I hope you can make time soon for a round of golf. Miller & Rowe Insurance Agency has changed over the years. In 1957, Harold Miller left and Howard Carter joined. Howard built the new facility on the north side of Railroad Street in 1974. He and his wife Julie purchased the business in 1982. Al and Judy Fain of Ottawa later purchased the business and operated it for many years. Today, First State Insurance occupies that building. Gert and I enjoyed 41 years together, and while we never had any children of our own, we enjoyed the visits of the Lightning Bug kids, and we had a very special relationship with our nieces. Thinking back, I want you to know our employees were family to us. Some stayed for years, some moved on to make their own mark in the world. Miller Row was my pride and joy for more than 55 years. I leave you now to go back and have a chat with Doc Nichols. You know, we have another fishing trip to plan. So, thank you.
I'm Louis Carter, and I'm real glad you want to hear some of the stories about some of us buried here in Precinct Cemetery. First of all, my wife Cora told me that I shouldn't try to memorize today because my 150-year-old memory just ain't what it used to be. Anna, wherever you are, I could use a damn teleprompter over here. Sorry, Cora. Cora told me I should watch my language. Look around and you'll see the graves of a lot of Carters who made their homes here in Earlville. So let me tell you how the Carters first came here. My grandfather, Samuel Olds Carter, along with his wife Lorena and 2 kids, and Sam's brother Levi, were well-known pioneers in these parts. In 1835, they and their 2 children traveled by boat from St. Lawrence County up near Canada, by boat to Detroit, and then by covered wagon drawn by oxen to the township of Earl. At that time, the area was mostly inhabited by friendly Indians, led by Chief Shabona or Shabna. I hear you call them Native Americans now. That's a pretty damn good name. Sorry, Cora. A year later, Samuel's father Joel and 5 more sons followed them here. Together, the Carters took up a total of 2,500 acres of land. They were here to stay. Samuel and Levi each made claims of land here, the patents signed by President Franklin Pierce. Samuel made his homestead on Section 17 on Big Indian Creek, east of what is now Earlville. Samuel and Lorena had 6 children, including my father, Joel, born in 1837. He was the first of 3 children to be born on the Carter homestead, and he was the first non-native born resident of Earl Township. There's still a Carter cemetery on that property, as you probably know. In 1841, Samuel donated the land where we're standing today for the purpose of establishing Precinct Cemetery. Several of the Carter graves were moved here later. In 1849, now you can see why I had to read this, I'm sorry. In 1849, Samuel was attracted by the gold rush in California, where for 9 years he made large sums of money only to lose it again in other speculations, and he returned home in 1858. While he was away, in 1853, the Chicago and Aurora Railroad, it was called then, extended their rail line from Chicago to Mendota, their right-of-way going through Samuel's property. As you know, the town of Earl was incorporated in 1863, and my grandfather Samuel would later serve as school director and elected justice of the peace. In 1861, my father Joel, at the age of 24, joined the 3rd Illinois Cavalry, serving in the Civil War under President Lincoln. He was wounded by a gunshot to the jaw a year later and wounded again in the leg, after which his cavalry days were over. Joel was a farmer and a popular auctioneer in these parts. After the war, he married my grandmother, Anna Swoveland, and they raised 5 children. This is where I come in: Louis, Clyde, Mark, Alma, and little Matilda Irene. I was born on the Carter homestead a year later after my father returned, and I was schooled in Earlville and spent most of my life here, farming during a lot of it. I was also a pretty damn good carpenter, but not as good as my brother Mark. As a young fella, I wanted to follow my father's footsteps and become an auctioneer, but with the economy in those days, that career didn't pan out too good. In 1907, I married my sweetheart, Cora Butterfield, whose family lived on a neighboring farm east of Earlville. We spent most of our married years here, except for a few years in Wisconsin and central Illinois. I also worked for the WPA for a few years in the southern states, The Depression took us wherever we could find work. One of my most interesting jobs was during World War II. Where I served as a watchman overseeing of a prison work crew building LSTs on the Prairie Shipyard in Seneca. That was a pretty tough job, but most all Americans were doing whatever they could to help us win the war effort. Those were damn rough years for most everybody. Sorry, Cora. My last and favorite job, as many of you remember, was as night watchman for the town of Earlville. My faithful dog Lady and I held that job for 12 years. We saw to it that most of those nights in Earlville were peaceful. There were a few exceptions from time to time, though. Around the time I retired, I got an emergency call from Whitey's Tavern. There was a bar brawl taking place, and it was out of control. Most everybody quieted down pretty quick after I got there. The one who didn't quiet down wished to hell he had. Sorry, Cora. He spent the night in jail. Cora and I had 7 children: Nellie Bedino, Barb Sanders, Robert, Bertha Wyatt, whose daughter Claudia attended Earlville High School, Jack, Glenn, and Ed. Our oldest son, Robert, died when he was still a young man. His son, Bobby, came to live with us in Earlville. After medical school, Dr. Carter returned to Earlville to hang up his shingle. I'm told his daughter, Lori, and my niece, Peg Carter, have put together impressive histories of the Carter family, and I'm much obliged for that. 2 of our children spent most of their lives in Earlville. Our daughter, Barbara, married Lawrence Sanders, a local Fuller Brushman later in his years, and they raised 7 children in their home across the street from us on Water Street. Many of you remember Barb as the manager of the Earlville School cafeteria for over 30 years. Their daughter, Barb Mathieson, and her husband, Bob, also lived their entire lives in Earlville. 2 of their children, Jane Bauer and Alan Mathieson, raised their families here, and I am told they continue to be active for the good of Earlville today. Our son, Ed, also spent most of his life in Earlville, where he and his wife, Norma, raised their son, Jay, and Ed was an Earlville rural mail carrier for 35 years. Cora and I enjoyed 63 wonderful years together until my death 53 years ago. Cora died almost 7 years later, and she's buried here beside me. Cora, I checked our gravestones to make sure they got everything right. She sends her love and her apologies to all of you. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed your visit as much as I did. Thanks again for stopping to see me. Much obliged.